Hi, welcome to Girl Up UAE's second podcast episode. I'm Anya.
I'm Shreya, and today's podcast is about different types of feminism and feminism in general. Okay, so Anya, what's feminism for you?
To me personally, I do believe that feminism is equality rather than favoring a women over men. However, this is a controversial opinion, and everybody else may have different views on what feminism is to them. So, what are your views?
When we talk about feminism, I think feminism is, you know, me being able to express myself without having to worry about, gender norms or talking about what society would think and, what's normal to society. According to me, feminism is also when, there isn't exactly much of a difference between the two genders, because honestly there is a difference and there's a beautiful difference between the different genders, but it isn't one that should be looked down upon and thought of as something that's shouldn't be looked down upon, shouldn't be thought of something as oh, she's a girl and there's things she can do and she can't do, and he's a boy and there's things he can do and he can't do. There's this beautiful difference, and I feel like it should be celebrated every day instead of being.
Yeah, I completely agree. And knowing that there are two different forms of reputations for feminism, I think I would be more towards the positive side, which is equality. And I truly believe this because there are different forms of feminism, and it really depends on which type of feminism you support that influences your view on feminism as positive or negative, etc. Because I think the more negative reputation of feminism, that is viewed as more negative. Is it? Okay, yeah.
I feel okay. So here's what: when feminism comes into the picture, there's so much negative stuff about it on social media, and I feel this really changes everybody's perspective on what feminism is. For certain people, it's just oh, this is trendy and it's popular and it's peppy and it's what's going around, so everybody's talking about it, so I'm gonna hop on the train. I'm gonna get into it as well. Whereas for others, when we talk about feminism, it's something they strongly believe in, and it's like really embedded into their morals, and they wear it. It's a coat that they wear with pride, and they step out of the house every single day, and they're ready to fight social norms and gender norms when they do so. Talking about this, let's start talking about toxic feminism. What are your thoughts on it, Anya?
So I do believe that some people abuse the word feminist, and they act in accordance of prioritizing women over men. And this can be unhealthy in certain situations, such as false allegations against men and other forms of unhealthy ways of expressing their so-called feminism, which then again just ends up putting down a whole gender as a whole instead of empowering both of them.
I definitely agree, because when we talk about toxic feminism, it's such a beautiful when we talk about in feminism in general, it's such a beautiful society and such a beautiful community to be a part of. We're all here for empowerment and we're all here for equality, but then the term sometimes gets abused, as you said. Everybody's like, oh, this is feminism, and they quote things which feminism wouldn't exactly believe in as feminism. I do understand that there are different types of feminism, and everybody's definition of feminism changes and differs because it depends on their morals and the background that they were brought up in, and the conditions that they had to face. But I do believe that when this term feminism is taken as an excuse to put down the other gender, and it's taken in to use when we need to talk bad about the other gender, and talk about how men in general are just like terrible creatures, and just there's some type of monster. It's just really heartbreaking, because feminism believes in, all genders being equal. We believe feminism in general, the term, believes in equality, and it believes in equal rights and, freedom of speech for everyone, access to healthcare, and medicine and medications. It also believes in, expression of people, and equal expression and equal opportunities. But toxic feminism, also there's this term, trending on social media, kill all men.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not it, because that's not what feminism believes in. As a society, we cannot thrive without the other gender. It's biologically and just socially not possible. But, what are your thoughts particularly on the phrase?
Yeah. So I think that is more radical in nature. So radical feminism essentially is just turning to radical change or extreme change rather than having a logical and steady viewpoint. And I feel like it's influenced more by emotions rather than logic, because okay, in theory, yes, fine, kill all men, okay, fine, all the problems related to gender inequality are solved. But in reality, that's not how it works at all. Like, even if you hate to admit it, we need men in our lives, and men need women in their lives. It's just how it goes. So I do believe that to an extent that this phrase does not do justice to what feminism is, but it only does justice to what a specific branch of feminism is, and that is radical feminism. That is the one type of feminism which I personally would not favor and would not agree with, as I do believe that kill all men is very extreme. It's not very nice in nature, and I think it generalizes all men into a fit category rather than looking and giving everyone an equal opportunity.
It does definitely categorize men into this one box of, being terrible men. They're just all terrible people, and they're these monsters, that God's made and we have to deal with. So, we bring out radical change and we kill them all. I feel when we talk about radical feminism, it's very similar to liberal feminism, but at the same time, it is so different, because both of them, it's the fact that it's just one small difference that makes them so different, even though they're so similar. And that is the difference where radical feminism, it in turns, it's celebrating the difference between the two genders, but it's doing exactly what, society wants them to do. And it's it's creating this big and thick wall between the two genders. And, it's just, it's complicating the matter more than it is. Because I feel feminism, what it, it aims to do is, in this, man-run world, a world that's, in all aspects run by men, it wants to give women an equal pedestal. It wants to put women on the same step as men, not above, not below, equal. And what radical feminism does is it completely changes what I think all the other feminism, all the other types of feminism are aiming for, which is this equal pedestal. And, even though liberal and radical feminism are almost same in the sense of, they want women to get more rights and, women have their place and position in, society. What radical feminism does is it brings women on this pedestal on top of men.
Yeah.
And I think right now, when this happens, we understand, I think this makes men understand the position that women have been for the past centuries of, women being below men. And, it's like women not having rights, women not having freedom of speech, expression, equal opportunities, equal rights, all of that. What happens is, when we, people who believe in radical feminism, what happens is radical feminism does the same to men. And honestly, as when we say that, oh, I'm a feminist, what we want is, we want an equal pedestal at all times. We want our future generations, the next generation of daughters and sisters to be on the same step.
That's equality, but what are your views on equity? So it's like, for example, have you seen those posts on Instagram where a kid may have the same form of stool to stand on as a tall grown man, and they're looking over a fence? I feel like equality, to an extent, yes, in theory that sounds great, but I think equity is also really important, because as we know that women have a few disadvantages in certain places, like for example in the workplace, like the glass ceiling or other factors. And I think it's important to focus more on women in certain aspects. And that doesn't mean that there is going to be zero focus on men at all. That's not what it is. But it's important to understand that although, yes, men and women are seen as equal, they do have certain disadvantages that men may not face, like their foundation, their empowerment, their support system, their goals. It just goes on and on and on. And that's why it's really important to build a strong foundation that's equal for both men and women. And that's essentially what I think. Plus, you also said that liberal feminism and radical feminism are similar in nature. I would say I'd have to disagree with that, because liberal feminism essentially is helping protect women's rights within the law. And I'm not saying it's very successful, but I'm also stating that it has given women the opportunity to file for a divorce against a man, and that wasn't previously there. There's forms of protection against domestic violence when women speak up within the legal system, as well as women having custody over their children and so on. So this I truly believe is highly important, and this is more positive compared to radical feminism. But there's also institutionalized sexism as well, where women, even if they do speak up about domestic violence, for example, they may not be given the proper treatment, or the way that they deal with such certain domestic violence cases may not be ideal, and this can just lead to being more dehumanizing than anything else.
I do agree that, liberal feminism is very important for society, and, what they're doing, to get women rights, and divorce and custody, all of that. It's very, very important to society. But here's what, radical feminism, where it is out there to eradicate, men in male dominating fields, as they call them, and in positions of power. That is what radical feminism is mainly out for. It does also believe in protecting women's rights and getting them their, laws and acts and everything. And so that is their difference, but that is their similarity. But the difference between the two is that radical feminism really acknowledges the sexual difference between the two genders, whereas liberal feminism does not. And it's way more of a free-going space. Keeping all of this in mind, let's start talking about women in literature and women in just more of the performing arts and cultural fields. So we'll start off with how in the 1800s and before women got their rights, women weren't allowed to publish books of their own. And we're going to talk about in reference to Little Women, the book. So you've read Little Women, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the protagonist, Jo March, is throughout the book shown to be this, independent woman. And, she talks about how she's never going to get married and how she's going to, publish her own books. And she even opens a school later on. And it's known that Jane Austen, what she did was, she did end the book with Jo as an independent character. Jo did not get married. But what happened was her publishers weren't okay with that. They did not want, this idea. They considered this a very filthy idea, a woman not getting married and living on her own. They considered it very, very polluting to society. And they thought that this was polluting the young minds of women, the minds of young women. And what happens is the publishers wouldn't let her publish the book the way it was. So they made her change the storyline, according to which in the end, Jo marries the professor and, they get married, they open their own school and, she starts to live on with him. So, and, nowadays, a book can publish whatever, the writer wants the story to have. Women are much more independent characters in current day literature. So what are your thoughts on, literature back then and literature now that after women have certain rights?
I truly believe that women do have the opportunity now to write more, publish more, etc. Although there are certain setbacks, obviously, like probably being less favored upon compared to male writers, etc. in the workplace, especially if you are a writer like commercially, not just publishing books like in advertising, etc. I do believe that that's a whole concept on its own. But yes, there are so many more women that have come up and become famous authors. Like, for example, Caroline Duffy, she writes poems. She's a Scottish woman, if I'm not mistaken, and she's part of our IGCSE syllabus as well. So it's very interesting to read about her life experiences and how she expresses herself in her poems. And yes, women have a lot of opportunities now, which they didn't back then. Like, if we take our time to go back to the Shakespearean era, where plays and theater was like really important and it was the main form of entertainment, you'd know that men played all the female characters within the play. Even if it was, if you've heard of Twelfth Night, there was a specific character who was a female disguised as a male. So the person that was playing this character was a male that was that was disguised as a female, pretending to be a male. Like, there's just so many complications that were brought by women not being allowed in theater and to act in these plays, and I think that that was very stupid and it was very silly, not to mention. But now it's very stereotypically associated to be to theater to be associated with women and somewhat men. Yeah.
It is theater is given this more feminine how to say identity now than it was back then, because back then theater was all about men, and because theater was moving, theater was in a place, and they were always moving for their shows, and they were going around the kingdom, in the Victorian era specifically. They were going around the theater companies, they were going around putting up their plays, but now theater companies and theater that's on the wheels is not very, how do I say, it's to be honest, it's completely gone to most extent. It's in the more rural areas where moving theater is still a part. But what happened in this transition of modern day theater into modern day theater from Victorian era, where theater was definitely more male dominated, theater now and is just given more of a feminine identity. Theater is identified as very feminine, and even plays, they're considered very feminine. They definitely might not be, and there are men that play characters in theater, but it's just that is more of a feminine part of cultural performing art. Same goes for dance. Dance was also dance that was performed in the court of kings and queens. There'd be a female dancer, and there'd be a male dancer. But again, dance was considered more of a male-dominated field. Whereas now, dance, in most essence, is a very feminine art. And to be honest, all cultural and performing arts, from going to completely male-dominated, fields back in the day, they've become. I wouldn't really say female dominated, but I would say that they're given a very feminine identity.
Yeah, and as well as back then, when it was just how it's portrayed in Bridgerton, it was all so classical and everybody was dressed so posh. Men were the ones who literally wore makeup, they wore wigs, they wore all these characteristics that are associated with now being feminine. I feel like it's a very contradictory approach now, because now if you see a man wearing makeup, okay, it's more socially acceptable than previously. However, it would still be looked upon as seeing them as more feminine and less manly. So it's very different in nature now than it was before, which is very...
It's not considered macho, or it's not considered, that's what a typical man should be. Where honestly, there is no typicalness to a particular gender, but again, societal norms and gender norms. I think this is also something feminism is battling against. Breaking all societal norms and gender norms that have been built up. Stereotypes, as we call them. Gender stereotypes and social stereotypes that men and women in society have to fit into. You also mentioned Caroline Duffy, who, if I'm not wrong, like you said, Scottish author.
Yeah.
So this is in IGCSE literature. So I study in an ICSE school. So I'm going to talk about ICSE literature. We have Sarojini Naidu, who was an Indian author at the time of independence. She was still part of the colonial, she was in the movement. She was in the freedom movement of getting rid of the British colonialism on India. So let's talk about the difference, the different types of feminism when we talk about. Do you think that women of color have a different perspective and a different idea when it comes to feminism compared to women that aren't of color, compared to white women?
Yeah, I definitely, there are two different forms of feminism. Like originally it was when feminism was introduced, there was a concept known as white feminism, which was mainly focused on equal rights for women that were of Western culture rather than ethnic minorities and etc.
Caucasian women in general.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that was the main focus. Like their focus was, yes, equal rights for women, men, okay, whatever. However, it was turning a blind eye towards the ethnic minorities, and that's what arose a different form of cultural feminism, and I think it's termed as Black feminism, if I'm not mistaken. But it's an umbrella term to include ethnic minorities as well, and that is pushing for equal rights within females of different ethnic minorities as well.
I'll tell you why it's called Black feminism. So even when the Indians and people of color started moving to the UK this is post-colonialism. So this is after most of the British Raj and the British colonialism had ended. When they started moving there, to lead normal lives, they were expats in these countries. They faced a lot of racism, and Black it wasn't a term that was saved and it was gatekept just for one type of racism. It was just racism towards South Asians, Blacks, Arabs, just everyone in general. And that's when there's a lot of posters from back in the day where people of color are just against this, and they're like, say no to this, and we want equal rights and we want equal respect. And that's when Black feminism came into term around during industrialization and urbanization, when women of color started entering the workplace. And they realized that there's definitely a difference between the white man and the white woman, but the man of color earns even lesser than a woman, a Caucasian woman, and a woman of color earns even lesser than a man of color. So that's where Black feminism came into perspective. And I feel when we talk about feminism, whereas we do believe in equality, and we do believe that when equality comes into picture, we do also want equal rights from color and our skin, our race, everything. But we also need to understand that there is a difference, and it's a difference that we cannot neglect. It's a difference that we need to identify and we need to put into picture, because women of color aren't really in European and Western nations. They're in third world countries. That's where women of color are present. And whereas, right now, white women are fighting for rights such as protected, healthcare rights and protected, custody and stuff like that. Women in certain third world nations aren't even allowed to inherit their father's property.
Plus, I also think it's really ironic because India, China, they make up most of the world's population. So a lot of Indian women, and there are a lot of Chinese women, and they all live in, per se, like, for example, certain Western countries or their home country or etc. But those that do live in Western countries, despite making up majority of the population, they're still considered an ethnic minority. And being a woman itself as well, I feel like that is really, really ironic that despite making up most of the population, they're still considered a minority, and then the gender aspect comes in as well after that, which I don't believe should be a thing in the first place. But this just shows the impact of Western feminism in a certain aspect as well. And I think, just going back to what you said about Jane Austen, I think in modern media as well, like for example, Bridgerton, there's a specific character. Her name is Penelope. So she is encouraged to, you know, find a guy and whatsoever. And her mother discourages her writing and all of that. So there are a lot of different forms of feminism, and they all have different branches of beliefs that come underneath them as well.
Like you brought up Bridgerton, there's this other show called Dickinson on Apple TV. And this show is based off of Emily Dickinson, who was a poet in the 17th century. And in the first season, there's this scene on the dinner table where, she's just talking about, and everybody's, talking about their day and how it went. And Emily, tells her parents and her siblings that, I've got a good news. And her parents go, okay, yeah, go ahead. What is it? And they were, expecting her to say something like, she's finally found a guy, or, she's finally ready to, get set up by her mom or someone. And she says that she's published a poem. And her father doesn't know what to say. And later on in the series, it's shown that her father would abuse her when she would, try to break the societal norms of the time. And even in the beginning, in the first season itself, there's multiple times where she's like, she wants to publish a poem, and there's just one person, there's this one character, and he's been supporting her since the beginning. And I don't remember the character's name, but what happens is, he goes like, oh yeah, I'll publish your poem under his name. And then, he says, when are you going to publish one finally under your name? And, she says about how her father's going to kill her, and, how she's going to defame the family name, and how she's really scared. And then, she makes a sudden decision, and she's like, okay, you know what? Publish it under my name. Do it. Pull the trigger. And when he does, as someone who'd want, support from her family, she didn't get that. There's also the scene in the show where there's this professor that's in town, but it's men only that are allowed to attend his lecture. So Emily and her best friend dress up as men, and they go and attend the lecture. And then, some of them recognize that, okay, wait, these aren't men. So they have to run out of the lecture, and they have to run away. And they're laughing and they think it's hilarious, but at the same time, they're really scared that, okay, if someone finds out, we're gone for. So I think this is what is very different in today's society. This is present day portrayal of a show of a storyline set in the 17th century. But now this is present day cinema. Now let's talk about movies and TV shows in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. Women were portrayed very differently from what they are portrayed right now. So why don't you go ahead and start talking about that?
Yeah, so I think the way women have been portrayed and during that time period was they were overly sexualized towards the male gaze, and there was just a certain portrayal of them being emotional, being the caregiver. And I think even right now, like even if you see a lot of kitchen appliances advertisements, you'll always see women. Like I can't remember the last time I saw a man in a blender commercial, to say the least. So I think there's still a lot of stereotypical viewpoints and the way that women are presented in certain movies and shows, especially back then. And I think you've heard the saying, I think it's famous on TikTok, you're written by a man or you're written by a woman, right? So the ones that are typically associated with being written with a man
Written by
are...
a man? Oh, those are some very interesting.
Exactly.
Those are some very interesting characters. I think this is, again, when there's a male writer to a character, or a male writer for a show or anything, a man pens down a woman. His way of describing a woman is a lot more, how do I say this? It's definitely a lot more sexualized than how a woman would write about a woman.
Yeah.
Whereas when a man writes about a man, there's only two parts of it. There's a strong, independent. There's a typical man, what society considers as typical, and then there's this other man that's considered as weak. He's not considered as he's the black sheep. He's not the right one out there. He needs some fixing to be done. Whereas when a woman writes about a man, it's very different. A woman writes about a man in his, in like his natural being, she writes about him, but she doesn't try to make him seem like, he's so strong, and she doesn't try to idolize him, or she doesn't try to how do I say this, victimize him either. There's this beautiful balance when a woman writes a male character. There's there are the parts where the man he's given his certain characteristics that a particular character would have, but when a woman shows a man to be vulnerable, it's a lot more different than when a male writer writes and shows for the male character to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think also the way that men portray women is, yes, they seem overly emotional, but at the same time, they're all dressed up still. Like, okay, the max they'll go to is runny mascara, but their hair will still be somewhat in place. Like, there's just so much of glamorization on women who are upset as well. Like, she'll probably have a wine glass in her hand, or it's just a very typical or overly glamorized way of women showing their emotions. Like, for example, in movies you'd see that a lot of women, when they wake up in the morning, suddenly they have like the slightest amount of makeup on their face, but that's not how it is.
And their eyes are perfect. They weren't drooling in sleep. They're just, they wake up and they're like ready. But I feel here's what this does for a young mind as well. I feel these unrealistic expectations and this unrealistic glamorization that is portrayed, it's got a really negative impact on the young minds that are watching this. So when a young girl sees let's talk about Disney movies in general, because young children, they're not always watching actual movies. When they're seeing Disney movies, why does the Disney princess always need a Prince Charming? Make it make sense, Disney. I don't like how she's got perfect hair. She's got runny mascara. She's always wearing high heels. She's wearing these big poofy dresses. And I get it. It's a princess. You want to give her a little... you want to give her that little sparkle. But there's these things that are super unrealistic. And but this is... if we compare the Disney that we grew up with and present day Disney, it is so different. Like, let's talk about Frozen in general. Elsa doesn't have a Prince Charming. She does it she does it on her own. She's a queen. She's absolutely killing it. She's doing a great job. Then there's Merida from Brave, who again breaks so many stereotypes, so many gender stereotypes with her character. She doesn't like her hair tied up. She doesn't like tight corsets. She, so many men come to her, for her hand in marriage, and she practically rejects all of them. She also saves her mother. She doesn't need another man to save her. Go on.
Yeah, as well as Moana, because I found that's very interesting movie per se, especially for younger girls, because she's told at a very young age that her ambition to go out in the ocean and to venture out, which most men were doing, and they were all like on the sea, etc. She should not have been allowed to do that. And despite like facing these setbacks from her father and her family, she still went out of her way to do that, and she still broke
so that she could save her family. And
exactly.
but I think Moana's character is very interesting because Moana's character was raised to be a queen, and those were her people. She was supposed to lead them, but she wasn't supposed to go out because that was what men were supposed to do, and she wasn't supposed to leave the island. But when she realized that things are getting serious and she needs to go and get that pendant so that she can save her people, she stepped up like a real true leader, and she went ahead and ventured out, and she did save her people. So I think Disney definitely, in the sense today, has, I'd say, it's become a lot more realistic than it was with what we grew up with. But I feel definitely a lot more. I feel women of color representation is something Disney still lacks in present day. For example, when Aladdin came out, I completely lost it. I was like, this is my time to shine. Jasmine is brown. I'm brown. This is it. This is a match made in heaven. Everybody keep quiet. Everybody keep quiet. Like, it's just the little representation that, because it's so, how do I say this? It's so not normal. It's so unconventional for women of color to be given normal representation, because they're given this very stereotypical representation of hairy, sweaty, awkward, brown kid, or like, hairy, sweaty, over, techie and like, really awkward brown girl. It's like seeing those stereotypes get broken, and like, a princess that's a woman that's also of color was just, for 8-year-old me, I could not handle it. I was just like, wait a second, hold up. Not only that, women of color, talking about women of color representation, MCU is currently doing a great job giving South Asian, people representation in Miss Marvel. Have you seen Miss Marvel yet?
No.
Okay, you have to start watching Miss Marvel. So, Miss Marvel, the things I would say about the show. So a new episode comes out every Wednesday. Everybody go watch Miss Marvel. And there is South Asian music. They're eating South Asian food. They're the budget. If I genuinely know that if the budget was bigger, this show could have been so good. But even with the small budget that the producers and directors worked with, it is such a great show with a complete brown representation. There's a hijabi, there's so multiple hijabi characters. The main protagonist is a South Asian girl who's an actual teenager, and it's perfect. It's not like people in their mid-20s who are acting as teenagers. She's an actual teenager. She's brown, and she the way she talks about her culture, she actually visits Pakistan in the show. It's just, the representation is just everything I could ever ask for as a brown person. Of course, when we talk about it, is the bare minimum, but just seeing it just your culture actually being appreciated and not appropriated, and just seeing that on the big screen is just, it's so comforting. It has this amount of happiness to it. And generally just the MCU in empowering women is doing such a great job, in my opinion, because none of the female characters are stereotypical female characters. They're all such epic and such wonderfully written, characters. There's Wonder Vision, there's Captain Marvel, there's Miss Marvel. Just who else? There's There's Valkyrie. Wonder Woman's DC, but even Wonder Woman in general, female superheroes are just there's these unconventional female characters, but the way that they're written, that's what we appreciate.
It's really empowering, I'd say.
It's very empowering. If you've seen Endgame, in the end where everybody is just tired because Thanos has been a lot to deal with, and all the female characters in the MCU, they get together, and then they're like, okay, we're gonna deal with him. Y'all can take the back seat now. That scene was everything. And just genuinely, women in the MCU is just so empowering, and that representation, it does feminism right. It does feminism rightly. What we've been working for when we say, we're feminists, we're working for equal rights. It's characters such as, the MCU female, superheroes that, they do us and they make us feel represented, and they make us feel like, okay, now that they're not going to do the stereotypical characters anymore. They're giving it a more realistic approach. They're giving it a more empowering approach, so that the young audience.
A negative aspect to that, because there was, I think, She-Hulk, if I'm not mistaken, that came out, and that was a female version of Hulk, and although they had a very high budget for it, it wasn't lived up to the expectation, and I feel like there's certain differences despite all these movements and despite all this happening currently in the media.
There definitely is, but just I feel like we're currently, as a society, I feel like we're on the right way, we're on the right path.
Yep.
We're on the right track to bringing women and men on the equal pedestal, and for a more secure future for the next generation of women and men in society. Because when we work towards equal rights, we're not only protecting the rights of the women of the next generation, but we'll also be protecting the rights of the men of the next generation. Because in society, men and women have to work. It's this symbiotic relationship that you have to work together. It's a team, and if you're not holding hands and if you're not doing it together, it's just not going to work out.
Right. And I think we've gone over like everything, honestly. Like, we've gone over the types of feminism, what feminism is, the changes of feminism over time, and the different reputations. So considering all of this, we'd like to conclude today's podcast episode. And if you'd like us to talk about any other specific topics, you can always reach out to our socials, and we will upcoming episodes.
Podcasts. Do let us know how you like today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
Bye.